Good morning, everyone, and welcome to People's Church. Whether this is your first time at People's Church, or you come every Sunday, or anywhere in between, I welcome you. My name is Laura MacLellan, and I'm from the Sunday Services Committee. People's Church is a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association and part of a tradition of liberal religion. Here, our mission is to be a beloved community, embracing and serving our diverse world. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that the UUA's virtual General Assembly is taking place next week. The information about it can be found in your weekly email. This morning's reflection comes from Hilary Hunt, who was unexpectedly unable to join us this morning, so I'll be reading it for her. Hilary grew up at People's Church in the 1990s and currently lives in Kalamazoo, which is located on Potawatomi lands. She has worked in nonprofit environmental conservation for nearly a decade and has studied nonprofit management, terrestrial ecology, social work, and the Spanish language. Our summer services are a bit different. So after our reflection, we will be separated into small breakout groups to discuss the questions for sharing and listening. And then we'll come back together for our closing words. So welcome everyone. And now let us sing. The words for this morning's chalice lighting come from Julianne Lapp. We seek our place in the world and the answers to our heart's deepest questions. As we seek, may our hearts be open to unexpected answers. May the light of our chalice remind us that this is a community of warmth and wisdom and welcoming of multiple truths. Each Sunday, we take a moment to share with one another the joys and sorrows, concerns and milestones in our lives. If you would like to share, please type your message into the chat box and I will read your message aloud. If you would prefer not to share the details, you may type the word stone into the chat box and we will keep you in our thoughts. I'm going to pause the recording so that you have some measure of privacy. The words for this morning's offering come from John Saxon. This religious community exists by its mission, as a fire exists by burning. But a fire cannot burn without fuel. And it is the time, the energy, the imagination, the vision, the creativity, the compassion, the love, and the financial support of the members and friends of this community that fuels our mission to nurture and sustain a welcoming, inclusive, and diverse liberal religious community that transforms lives and serves the world. Your support, the free and generous support of each and every member and friend of this community, is what fuels this community and its mission. And without your support, the flame of justice, community, and love cannot burn brightly to warm ourselves and be a beacon in a world threatened by division and fear. The offering will now be received. Please join in giving thanks for all that sustains us. You can find the words in the chat box. From the countless gifts we each have been given, gifts of life and love and sustenance, we bring these small portions to share in the works of love, which none of us can accomplish alone.
As tranquil streams that meet and merge and flow as one to seek the sea, our kindred hearts and minds unite. and bids the soul in search of truth adventure boldly and explore. Prophetic Church, the future waits your liberating ministry. Go forward in the power of love, proclaim the truth that makes us free.
The reflection this morning is from Hilary Hunt, and it is Decolonizing Conservation. Good morning. My name is Hilary Hunt, and I use she, her pronouns. Thank you for coming to the service this morning and for listening to me. I was very fortunate to be raised at People's Church in the 90s and returned to the Kalamazoo area in 2018. It is great to be back. In keeping with today's theme of decolonization, we acknowledge that the land we are currently occupying in and around so-called Kalamazoo is Potawatomi land. Last summer, I spoke to you around my expertise, which is land conservation. This summer, I speak to you about my growth and learning around decolonizing that same topic. I think it is very important to stress here that I am a beginner and neophyte on this topic. I do not say that to help cover myself in case I make a mistake. I say it because regaining humility is part of my journey to unravel the toxic threads of white supremacy. In a predominantly white culture, it's very unusual and frowned upon to stand up before a group of people and call yourself a beginner. Any admission that you might lack knowledge or expertise is considered weakness, especially in a group of highly educated people who value subject matter expertise. However, I have been fortunate to receive liberatory teaching and accountability from others and have made use of countless resources, including books, webinars, podcasts, and more, which have helped me begin to untangle the threads of white supremacy woven into my conditioning. It's important to position oneself and acknowledge privilege and power coming into any new space, because this keeps us accountable. As a white person in the United States, I am a colonizer. The fact that my ancestors came here and were part of systematically removing, oppressing, and very likely killing Indigenous people is part of my identity. My existence, success, financial well-being, home ownership, and work on this land is part of a long chain of events that was made possible through colonization and genocide. As a child, I was taught about Indigenous people during history class. It was only in college when I realized this error, teaching that Indigenous people in Michigan were a mostly historical topic. In a social work class, I heard one of my fellow students speak about the process of relearning her native language and realized my mistake. Of course, it wasn't just my mistake. This was an intentional societal erasure, and it is up to us to decolonize ourselves. Decolonizing means removing all forms of supremacy and oppression that were created through colonization. It means releasing everyone and everything from all hierarchies. But it's not just undoing colonization. It's also supporting Indigenous resurgence and well-being, and acknowledging truths and working to make repairs for past harms. Over the last 7 or 8 years working at environmental nonprofits, I have observed the field grow from extreme resistance to any of these topics to an almost mainstream recognition of the importance of anti-oppression and anti-racism work. Unfortunately, there's always a few holdouts, but more importantly, most of the work has still a long way to go to be put into practice. for the most part, conservation is still an enforcer of colonization rather than a liberatory framework. Let's start with the great heroes of conservation in the United States. Most of us are likely familiar with John Muir, who was heavily involved in the so-called creation of Yosemite National Park. I think at this point, most people know that Muir's white supremacist romanticization of Western landscapes saw them as free of people, wild, and unpopulated. This delusion is where the nation's national park policies of removal came from. There are well-researched articles on the topic, but I would like to share a story I heard on a webinar about Indigenous-led conservation, led by Peter Forbes of the First Light Collective. This story took place when Muir visited Tlingit territory in what we now know today as Alaska's Glacier Bay National Park. On the first visit, he rode in a canoe with a Tlingit hunter. When they came around a bend, the hunter aimed his weapon at a deer that had come into view. John Muir rocked the canoe so that the hunter couldn't aim properly. 30 years later, Glacier Bay National Park was established and Tlingit people were removed 25 miles away. There would be no more hunting there. As recently as 1972, the National Park Service burned out a summer fishing camp to make way for a visitor center. Just 3 years ago, they finally offered an official apology for that action. From this example, you can see that conservationists have literally deprived Indigenous people of food to make way for conservation. The action of conserving land has driven Indigenous people from their homes and into hunger. This is one of many examples. Cases such as this from out west have received extra publicity due to the public's fascination with these jaw-dropping landscapes. However, there are examples just as egregious that happened here in the Great Lakes region. There is a clear relationship between the theft of Indigenous lands and the simultaneous addition of conservation lands. This is a shameful legacy, but it is also the truth. It is up to us to reverse this trend. Rematriation is an important part of that reversal. Rematriation, or the return of stolen lands, is becoming a part of national discourse, on par with the idea of reparations. So how can we go further here in our region? Before I go into some ideas, I want to recognize that these suggestions are not my intellectual property. Instead, they're the result of reading and learning from Indigenous people. To close, we'll move from the biggest idea, land scale, to the smallest, individual scale. One common practice with conservation projects is to name them after the donor or the owner, usually white, who gave the land to the conservancy or government entity. If we acknowledge that the donor's ownership of the land came about through colonization, it is entirely reasonable to question whether using their name simply continues that legacy and the erasure of whose land it really is. Does one family holding the deed for 25 years erase 10,000 years of coevolution between people and land? In Massachusetts, the Native Land Conservancy and the Northeast Wilderness Trust have taken it a step further. These groups have joined in a new partnership to grant land rights to NLC and the Wampanoag Nation, and to explore common goals between conservation and Indigenous tradition and lifeways. The Trust's board passed a resolution acknowledging the limiting definition of public access to their preserves and the ways the word doesn't describe Native communities and their relationship with and to the land. Simply making the nature preserves open to the public is not enough, and this is not respectful of the Wampanoag's relationship with the land. Instead, they entered into a cultural respect easement, which is attuned to the Wampanoag Nation's desires for their citizens' use of the land, including the right to access the land for cultural practice and oral tradition. In addition to land access, the use of land acknowledgements is becoming expected and more widespread. Acknowledgement is a simple way to resist the erasure of Indigenous histories and work towards seeing and honoring the truth about colonization. However, acknowledgement is the bare minimum. What about educating the public towards decolonization? Interpretive signs at nature centers and preserves could include Indigenous place names, important cultural information, names of wildlife and language lessons. Instead of having Latin names on interpretive signs, what about Potawatomi names? After all, it was not a Roman who first used names for native North American wildlife. As a final thought, the racial wealth gap was created through colonization. Taking actions to be a visible ally and supporter of Indigenous sovereignty only goes so far. There is a very real and very serious gap in household income and family wealth between white colonizer and Indigenous families. Stolen land that has been appreciating in value for 100 years only worsens that disparity. To help remedy this, many people are paying voluntary land taxes. I am one of them. Voluntary land taxes are donations that acknowledge our access to stolen land. Giving resources back to their rightful owners feels a lot better than paying rent to a landlord or sending mortgage payments to a bank. These payments don't have to be enormous to be impactful. I give small monthly gifts, and this adds up to hundreds of dollars a year. Ensure that the recipient of these taxes is an Indigenous-led organization, such as Honor the Earth, Minnesota-based, or the Native Justice Coalition, Michigan-based, both of which are Anishinaabe-led. As a final note, about 20% of the world's land area is formally owned and held by Indigenous people, yet that land protects approximately 80% of the globe's biodiversity. I think it's time to rethink who we call the conservation experts. To close, I again thank you for reflecting with me today. Thank you for listening and thinking over these topics. All right, thank you, Hilary. And I'm sorry, Hilary, for butchering your speech. All right, so we are going to do some group discussion here. AV is going to post our questions for sharing and listening in the chat, and we will be divided into small groups for about 15 minutes of discussion. So as a guideline for discussion, please speak the truth as you understand it. To avoid inhibiting the flow of discussion, do not comment on others' comments until everyone has had a chance to do initial sharing. And I'm going to pause the recording for this.
Wake now my senses and hear the earth call. Feel the deep power of being in all. Keep with the web of creation your vow. Giving, receiving as love shows us how. Wake now my reason. Reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim who quests for the true. Honor the beauty and wisdom suffering fill the white sky. Take as your neighbor, both stranger and friend, praying and striving their hardship to end. Wake now, my conscience, with justice thy guide. Join with all people whose rights are denied. Take not for granted a privileged place. God's love embraces the whole human race. Wake now, my vision of ministry clear. Brighten my pathway with radiance here. Mingle my calling with all who will share. Work toward a planet transformed by our care.
Our closing words come from Andrea Hawkins Camper. May we see all as it is, and may it all be as we see it. May we be the ones to make it as it should be. For if not us, who? If not now, when? This is answering the cry of justice with the work of peace. This is redeeming the pain of history with the grace of wisdom. This is the work we are called to do, and this is the call we answer now. To be the barrier and the bridge, to be the living embodiment of our principles, to be about the work of building the beloved community, to be a people of intention and a people of conscience.